Hello, this is Civics Ain't Dead. I'm here with Butch, or Johnny, as some of you may know him. I'm Sundance Kid, or Josh. Um, Tonight, we're going to talk about the question of censorship. And there's a bunch of different ways to tackle it. So, we've actually envisioned a way of discussing this in three parts. So, if you're listening to this is part one. We're going to think about sedition and loyalty to the U.S. government and what um, sort of broad patterns of censorship have looked like through the first 150 years of American history. And in part two, we're going to get into a question of cancel culture that's been relevant for the past decade or so, and talk about like what is cancel culture compared to censorship more properly. And then in part three, we're just going to ask, are we in a new age of McCarthy, as some political pundits have suggested over the past few years? Um, so, just to start, that's actually a good place to start. It feels, in some ways, that we're living in a new age of censorship. But of course, there have always been accusations of 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 this sort of like broader cancel culture coming from academics, left wing journalists, and Hollywood executives and so forth. So, Johnny, what would you say to start the difference between censorship and cancel culture is?
Yeah, well, obviously censorship's been around a long time, and cancel culture is a new phenomenon, at least by that name. Um, but that's not really an answer. I think the real answer is, when I think about like a formal definition of censorship, I think that it has to involve the state, right? So government is actually censoring um, free speech or free thought or free expression of some sort, right? And so, I think the line that separates kind of more broad cancel culture stuff from actual censorship is that there is a government authority saying you can't talk about this, or you can't say this, or if you do say this, there's going to be punishment. Um, so I think the state is the obvious distinguisher there. For
And okay, all right. So then the follow up question is, you're the early American expert. So if we're in an era of censorship right now, you're like, how far back does this go? Is this something new for American history, or like are there historical precedents to a state imposed government censorship in American history?
Well, it goes all the way back, right? So you want to talk about like cancel culture? We could go all the way back to the Stamp Act crisis before Revolution, right? Maybe we'll get into that later. But as far as like state censorship goes, I think the kind of clear consensus is that the first example we have of this in U.S. history is the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, so these come about in 1798, right? So literally less than 2 decades away from independence, and and even closer to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So we're talking about John Adams' administration. After George Washington has his 2 terms as president, John Adams comes in as the kind of the heir apparent. He's another Federalist as the first party system forms up. And in 1798, under Adams's administration, Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what these nominally are meant to do is police foreign interventions. There's a lot of suspicion at the time. Tensions with revolutionary France are on the rise. We're entering something called the Quasi-War, which we don't have time to get into the details of. But essentially, the U.S. and France are very near to going to war, and there's fear that revolutionary French agents are actually running amok in the US and threatening the stability of the federal government. Um, so there's a foreign element to this, right? They're worried about foreign influence coming from revolutionary France, which is seen as this radical kind of left wing revolution in Europe. And Adams and the Federalists use that as kind of the precursor to justify these acts and this crackdown on free speech, free expression, right?
And so,
Yeah.
like in that respect, is it the French revolutionaries who are kind of rooted out and targeted with these acts?
It, no, it's not, right? So there are, I mean, there's some evidence that there are French agents running around um, in the United States at the time, but they're few and far between, right? What Adams actually uses this for is to crack down on critics. So the backstory to this, right, is that kind of towards the end of Washington's administration, Thomas Jefferson famously resigns as a cabinet member and kind of becomes the leading voice of the anti-federalists, right? What will eventually become kind of the Democratic Republicans, as confusing as that term sounds to our ear today, right? But it's essentially what Jefferson pitches as the loyal opposition. So these are people in the U.S. that are critical of the Federalists, political party in power. They're critical of perhaps John Adams specifically as president, right? Um, and so John Adams does not appreciate this level of criticism. Washington's administration had not necessarily faced that level of criticism, and so this is a new crisis in America. As the Federalists argue, you can't critique the party in power, you can't critique the leadership because that is sedition. And Jefferson and kind of the anti-federalists would argue, of course you can. That's part of free speech. That's part of our First Amendment rights that are baked into this brand new Bill of Rights as part of the Constitution, right? So this act only really lasts for the last 2 years of Adams' administration. But during that time, Matthew Lyon, who is a sitting congressman, is jailed for criticizing Adams. There are several newspaper editors that get fined or imprisoned for what they are accused of as basically anti-government libel publications against the Federalists, right? And so it is a way that Adams uses the law to crack down on his political critics, right? And of course, it if anything, it adds fuel to the fire of this so-called loyal opposition. Jefferson runs against Adams in 1800. It's worth noting that Adams is very unpopular by then, even among his own party members, in part because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Because it is this kind of unanswered question of like, well, can't you still be a patriot even if you're criticizing your current government? Or are we just going to go straight back to kind of the way things were in England, where, you know, a critic against the government is somehow seen as an enemy of the state?
Yeah, I mean, my impression, which is limited, of John Adams is that he, of all the founding fathers, skewed a bit more monarchical in his worldview than others. I mean, certainly he's a founding father, but um, in my understanding, the Alien and Sedition Acts really are at the top of the list of the reasons why that might fit the bill for him. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, that's not wrong, right? I mean, he's right there along with the other Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, who's his ally during this period, right? That see the executive branch as being kind of the heir apparent to the old monarchy system, right? And so, you press different Federalists at different times, they're going to answer different ways. I don't think anyone, except maybe Hamilton, wants to have an American king, not even John Adams. But there is a sense that like the office of the presidency should be respected because it is the chief executive of the land. And therefore, if you come after the chief executive, you are in some way being disloyal. And again, the little d Democrats and the little r Republicans that are people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson would counter that and say, no, we're a republic, right? No man is above the law. That also means no man is above criticism, right? And that just being critical of your leaders doesn't by nature make you seditious. it makes you a patriot. As a matter of fact, it makes you the best kind of patriot because you're able to call out when your country falls short of its higher ideals, right? And of course, John Adams and Jefferson will go back and forth about this for decades. They have kind of this famous rivalry. They're kind of friends, but they're kind of frenemies, right? Over stuff like this. Um, and, I think it's an ongoing debate that we see even playing out now. I mean, you and I both have been accused of this from family members, at least, right? Of like being not supportive enough of a current administration, somehow making us less patriotic. There's the great Mark Twain quote that is maybe a Mark Twain quote, right? That is like loyalty to country always, loyalty to government when it deserves it. That's kind of my definition of patriotism as far as that goes, right? And I think that most people, if they're being honest with themselves, would say that, right? All these people that are maybe accusing you and I of not being sufficiently loyal now, some of these same people thought it was funny to chant "Let's go Brandon" 2 years ago. So,
I mean, there's a certain level of disingenuousness there on people who make those accusations for sure. I think you can frame it as loyalty to the government, but another way it's often thrown back in our faces is that our critiques are somehow radical, or they've made us radical leftists or liberals or snowflakes or any epithet you want to throw out there as like a left-wing ideology. And I think certainly with this one, this example of John Adams and France, that fits the bill, and that revolutionary France is a very, fair to say, radical left-wing ideology that's
sure.
underpinning this revolution in Europe.
And that frames a lot of the internal politics at the time, right? In the 1790s, all the way up through the War of 1812, the Federalists accused the Jeffersonians of being too sympathetic to the French Revolution. The Jeffersonians accused the Federalists of being too sympathetic to the British monarchy, right? And so there is this kind of great divide, even back then, that way, that makes sense. And of course, those divisions, the divisions are always there in American history. They just play out differently depending on what the debates are. So in the 1790s through 1812, the debates all focus on revolutionary France and Napoleonic Europe. After that, we get into the slavery crisis, right? The sectional crisis. And that's what brings us to the next kind of censorship highlights reel, I guess, is the gag order. This is a famous order in Congress, right? Another form of censorship, but this comes through the legislative branch specifically. 1836 to 1844, I think. It bans all debates on the floor of Congress that involve the abolition of slavery. Basically, the Congress was getting bogged down towards the end of Jackson's second term with all these petitions coming in from abolitionists, talking about how evil slavery was and how it needed to be either prevented from spreading westward or abolished altogether. And it just floods, it kind of slows Congress's paperwork to a halt, to the point where Southern delegates push for this so-called gag order, where we're not going to discuss slavery in the halls of Congress. We're not going to debate it. So that's obviously not a national censorship, but it's certainly a censorship push within the legislation. Of course, ironically, John Quincy Adams is one of the biggest opposition leaders to the gag order. That's John Adams' son. So he comes back around as kind of an anti-censorship. I guess the family comes back around as an anti-censorship family by the end of it. But all of this, right, is to say that censorship is not new, right? And it pops up during moments of tension throughout kind of the first 100 years of American history. And then the U.S., in the modern era, brings sedition back as a policing thing in 1918, right? And again, this has the same connection points as the earlier Sedition Act. In the 1790s, they're worried about radical revolutionary French influence. In 1918, they start to worry about Marxist influence from Europe, specifically, right? 1918 is the year after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so the Sedition Act that comes into effect in 1918 is meant to police any opposition to government in speech or print, which sounds a lot like John Adams' earlier Alien and Sedition Acts, right? And so again, it's this way during World War One of nominally cracking down on foreign influence, but it's a way to also protect against critique against the government, and that's what it becomes.
Yeah, I mean, and also that the Sedition Act falls within the framework of what we call the first Red Scare, which
Right.
is, one of the clearest examples of censorship in U.S. history. As you mentioned, it kind of comes on the heels of America's entry into World War One in 1917, and fears around the Bolshevik Revolution, and it lasts till like 1920. The thing to mention to start with the first Red Scare is that the fear is that a significant faction within the U.S. is gonna follow suit in some sort of worker revolution. The American labor movement in the 1920s is much stronger than it is today, and you have thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of socialists and communists who are running for office, and registered as in those parties. Eugene V. Debs, probably one of the more prominent socialists of the day. He's one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. He's a labor advocate. He's a trade unionist. He runs for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920.
Well, and it's not just political radicals, right? This statistic, I was reading about this the other day, and it came up. The estimate is that as high as maybe a quarter of all clergy in the U.S. expressed socialist sympathies in the 19-teens, right? So this is before the Russian Revolution, right? It's before kind of the Leninist radicalization of that movement, right? But like, we're talking about ministers. Picture, the preacher from the Grapes of Wrath or something that kind of workaday rural people are even entertaining the ideas of what does like an American Christian socialist movement look like in the 19th.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a period of intense labor unrest because of that. There are strikes, there are race riots, there are bombings, and you see a real crackdown by the federal government because of that. I mean, the news media, they feed into it. They create this kind of mass hysteria about these radical leftists. And importantly, and maybe this holds true with the Alien and Sedition Acts in the 18th century too, but there's very little effort, or maybe even a concerted effort, to not make distinctions between these different groups. Whether you're a communist or a socialist or an anarchist or just a social democrat who wants some sort of welfare state. The system of censorship and crackdown works better when the thing being defined is blurry and murky,
amorphous,
and amorphous, exactly. So people get rounded up just for being a member of a party or having association with a group, whereas the accusation is that they're moving towards a violent act of some sort.
So it's kind of like a damnation by association thing, where the most radical elements are the ones that get kind of publicized and highlighted, and therefore it justifies arresting or rounding up or cracking down on all of these elements, kind of on a spectrum of political ideology.
Yeah, I mean, you can broadly, at least for the first risker, you can broadly encapsulate that group as the left. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm,
anyone,
mm-hmm.
left of center at the time. So you have two real acts that come out. The Espionage Act of 1917 is passed to prevent interference with military operations and recruitment during World War One. This is the act that Eugene V. Debs is actually arrested and tried and convicted for violating, for his anti-war speeches,
Mm.
and that actually goes the whole way to the Supreme Court in 1919, and the Supreme Court upholds his conviction. I think it's like 10 years in prison, and then a few years later, President Harding commutes his sentence. But the broader one, and I think the scarier one for the time, is the Sedition Act, as you mentioned. 1918, President Wilson pressures the federal government to target and deport people for any of their speech and association linked to these groups, all constitutionally protected, of course.
Yeah,
Um, Making like little effort to distinguish between like actual terrorist threats and just people who have ideological
differences.
associations
Yeah.
with the communists and the socialists. So you get a bevy of arrests, of deportations, of appeals, and court decisions over the those last years of the 19 teens into the
Mm.
1920s. And I guess the one thing I'd want to stop and spend a few minutes discussing um, is a series of raids that happened in November 19 and January 1920, called the Palmer raids. This is after Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Um, so these raids, through these raids, there's thousands and thousands of suspected radicals arrested. They're triggered in part by a series of bombings in June 1919, including one at Palmer's home in D.C., and then uncovery of a mail bomb plot targeting government officials and business leaders, including J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. So
Interesting.
they unfold in two waves. The first one in November 1919 is much more limited, and then there are these mass raids in January of 1920. So who are they targeting? Primarily recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So we're talking about primarily Italians and Eastern Jewish immigrants who, at the time, were seen as "quote unquote" less desirable, right?
Right.
Um, Now, like an Italian today is going to be just passing as white. That
Hmm.
wasn't really the case 100 years ago.
Right.
And so federal agents, often in tandem with local police, would raid homes and meeting halls, often with violent tactics such as beatings, arrests without warrants,
Hmm.
and detention without bail or any legal representation. And what you get is like somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000, 6,000 to 10,000 people arrested, with only 556 being deported to the Soviet Union. Um,
Interesting.
so another way of putting that is like thousands and thousands of people arrested without due process.
Caught up
And
in this net without search warrants and without arrest warrants. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean the legacy of it is it's just a classic case of unconstitutional state behavior. From the outset, it's considered unconstitutional, primarily for violating
Search and
Fourth,
seizure and
Fifth,
yeah.
Sixth, Eighth Amendments. A lot of the Bill of Rights, like half the Bill of Rights, get violated with these raids, and just the wanton use of violence. Um, the Department of Labor often overturned deportation orders due to a lack of evidence or
Yeah.
violations of due process. And you actually get it's so bad that you actually get the foundation and the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU,
Interesting.
in
Coming out
1920,
of this.
coming out of this. Yeah. So, I mean, when I was kind of reading up on this to prepare for this recording, like I'm just like reading these things, thinking, man, reads a lot like some other raids that are happening much more recently.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's interesting, right? Because it's got the Palmer raids are kind of like two different strands of what we're seeing today, intertwined in a way that we haven't quite seen yet. What I mean by that, right, is you've got kind of the immigrant piece, right? So like the the Palmer raids sound like ICE raids, right? Where they're going in and they're not really caring who they catch or who gets caught up in this net. They just know that the undesirable immigrants of the day, in the case of the Palmer raids, that's Southern and Eastern Europeans, are going to get rounded up and possibly deported, right? So you've got that immigrant element, but then you also have this kind of ideological element, right? The accusation that these are all leftists, or that these people are bringing in radical ideas that are threatening or critical of the U.S. state. So in 1920, those two things are somehow linked. In 2026, they're not quite linked yet. Maybe? Question mark. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Josh?
I mean, yeah.
These are these strands. Are we watching these strands back together in real time?
Yes, I
Are
think we
these?
are.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
That's what I'm
it's
wondering.
it's a bit more nuanced than that. Like the accusation about, you know, Mexican and Central and South American immigrants, primarily
Yeah.
immigrants of color, is not that they're like radical Marxists; it's that they're drug users and rapists and violent criminals,
Right. Right.
which is obviously egregious and statistically less true than that of American citizens. But the question is, who's being targeted exactly by these raids? In 2025, certainly, the people getting deported, the immigrants are being targeted first and foremost, but you're also seeing protesters and neighbors who
Getting
are standing
targeted.
up
Yeah.
uh, for their neighbors getting targeted as well. And what are those people being labeled as? They're being labeled as radical
Radical
leftists.
professional protesters. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, domestic terrorists
Yeah.
even.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you do see the left wing ideology bugaboo come back. It
Starting
just
to twist together. Yeah.
it's tied to the people looking to defend their neighbors, less so
Hmm.
than the immigrants themselves. Um, and I just think that overall, like there's a similar pretense to action for both examples of the Palmer raids and the ICE raids. Like in 1920, it's suspicion that the group, simply because of their left wing ideology, may be on the path to violence.
Yeah.
And that suspicion is enough for the federal government to act violently and illegally to detain them. In 2025, the suspicion is that someone's illegal simply because of the color of their skin
Right.
or their accent or the neighborhood they live in.
Hmm. Or the job they're doing when they get picked up or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and that pretense and that racial profiling is grounds enough to arrest them violently and illegally.
Yeah. It's interesting parallels. Um, Especially interesting to think about, who the federal government is then using to enforce this. In this case, now we've got ICE as kind of the boots on the ground. Whether we're talking about raids, which we've seen now for months, or their new role of policing airports, apparently, right? Or as Steve Bannon keeps threatening, sticking them at polling locations by November. And then I think you really will see these strands draw a little too close together for comfort. Yeah, think
I think
about.
just
Yeah,
just to wrap it up though, for the question of censorship, what the Trump administration ultimately wants with ICE is the ability to send their agents onto the streets and operate with zero accountability. And it's the people recording with their smartphones that run counter to the ability to do that. So
mm-hmm.
the violence, I mean, I think a takeaway I've had from all of this is like there is a kind of intrinsic level of violence that goes hand in hand with censorship a lot
Yeah,
of times and aggression. And ultimately the intended goal is to have a chilling effect and get people to question, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe I should self-censor. In
Right.
this case, with raids, not go out and risk my life on the street to record what they're doing.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah. And the best antidote to that is to continue pulling it into the light, right? The more people see of that excessive force, the more people see kind of the reality of it, the less it will be justified. I mean, in hopefully the less it will be justified in people's minds. But that seems to have borne out in Minnesota to a degree. But again, of course, we lost. I mean, people were killed in the process. So the cost is high.